There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They wear the camouflage of a Tuesday night, or the quiet hum of a refrigerator, or the gentle weight of another person's sleep. You don't recognize them as turning points at the time. You can't feel the tectonic plates of your own heart shifting beneath you. It's only later, when you look back from a future you couldn't have imagined, that you see the moment for what it was, the closing of one door and the hesitant, trembling opening of another. For me, that moment smelled faintly of Finn's shampoo, a clean, green scent like crushed herbs after a rainstorm, and it felt like the almost imperceptible rhythm of his breathing against my ribs. He was asleep, utterly, deeply asleep on my couch, his head pillowed on my chest, one of his hands resting loosely on my stomach. The television was still on, casting a flickering, cool blue light across the living room, painting the sharp angles of my bookshelves and the soft edges of the armchair in a ghostly luminescence. The film we'd been pretending to watch had ended an hour ago. The credits had rolled in a silent, white procession up the black screen, and now some forgotten nature documentary was playing on mute. A school of silver fish moved as a single, shimmering organism through a dark, silent ocean. I felt a kinship with them, suspended as I was in my own silent, dark, and fathomless space, terrified that a single wrong move, a cough, a shift of my weight, the frantic drumming of my own heart, would shatter the delicate ecosystem of the moment. This had become our ritual, a new and precarious language we had started to speak in the months since his world had fractured. It was a language composed not of words, but of proximity and plausible deniability. It began with late nights and feigned exhaustion, and it had slowly, terrifyingly, evolved into this. An intimacy so profound it stole the air from my lungs, yet so fragile it could be dismissed in the morning with a sheepish grin and a mumbled, "Sorry, man, I must have been exhausted," and every time, I would say it was fine, that it was no problem, because the alternative, to ask what it meant, to name the colossal, unspoken thing that now lived in the space between us, was a risk I was too cowardly to take. The truth was, I had been in love with Finn for 6 years, and I had become an expert in the architecture of self-preservation. My heart was a fortress, and I had long ago bricked up the windows and barred the gates, all to protect a friendship that felt more essential to me than breathing. But now he was inside the walls. He had found a way in, not with a battering ram, but with a quiet, desperate, and perhaps unknowing plea for sanctuary. And I, the sworn protector of my own fragile peace, had simply let him in. I let him sleep on my chest, listening to the dual rhythm of our heartbeats, and I prayed to a God I wasn't sure I believed in that he couldn't hear how much louder mine was than his. We had met in a cavernous university lecture hall, one of those tiered auditoriums designed to make you feel both anonymous and exposed at the same time. I was a student of light and shadow, a photography major who spent most of his time behind a lens, more comfortable observing the world than participating in it. I always chose a seat in the back corner, a vantage point from which I could see everything without being truly seen. For the first 2 weeks of that art history course, the seat beside me remained empty, a small buffer of negative space that I cherished. Then, on a Tuesday in late September, Finn arrived like a minor weather event. He was late, breathless, and unapologetic, his bag slung over his shoulder and a chaotic energy trailing behind him like a cape. He scanned the crowded room, his eyes, a startling, clear blue, sweeping over the rows until they landed on the single empty seat beside me. He gave me a quick, brilliant smile that seemed to light up the dim room and dropped into the chair with a sigh of relief. He smelled of coffee and the crisp autumn air. He immediately turned to me, ignoring the professor who was droning on about the chiaroscuro techniques of Caravaggio, and stuck out his hand. "Finn," he said, his voice a low, warm hum. "I have a feeling I'm going to need to borrow your notes." That was the beginning. It was just that simple, and just that monumental. Finn was studying software engineering, a world of logic and code that was as foreign to me as the surface of the moon. Yet he'd enrolled in art history because, as he put it, you can't just build the machine, You have to understand what makes the world beautiful enough to want a machine in it. He was a collection of such charming contradictions. He was the star of the university's track team, disciplined and relentlessly driven. Yet he could lose an entire afternoon lying on the grass in the main quad, debating the merits of different cloud shapes. He was surrounded by people, a natural center of gravity in any social situation. But I soon learned that he was also profoundly lonely, a secret he guarded with easy laughter and a packed schedule. I was his opposite in nearly every way. I was quiet where he was loud, still where he was in constant motion. He collected people. I curated my solitude. Yet, from that very first day, we fit. It was a strange and immediate alchemy. He drew me out of my shadows, coaxing me into the light with a gentle, persistent patience. I, in turn, offered him a place of quiet, a harbor from the relentless demands of his own life. He didn't need me to be anyone other than who I was. With me, he didn't have to perform. He could just be. Our friendship became the central pillar of my university experience, and then of my life. It was built in the quiet hours, in late-night study sessions fueled by cheap pizza and terrible coffee, in long, aimless drives with the windows down, the radio playing songs we would later claim as ours, in the shared silence of watching the sunrise from the roof of my drab apartment building. He was the first person I showed my photographs to, not just the polished final prints for class, but the raw, vulnerable outtakes. He would look at them with an intensity that made me feel seen in a way I never had before. He didn't just see a well-composed image. He saw the emotion I was trying to capture, the story I was trying to tell. He saw me. In turn, I became a student of him. I learned the subtle tells of his moods, the way he'd run a hand through his hair when he was stressed, the slight downturn of his mouth when he was trying to hide his disappointment, the way his eyes would crinkle at the corners a split second before he genuinely laughed. I was a photographer, after all. My trade was the observation of minute details, of the way light falls on a subject to reveal its true nature. And Finn was the most captivating subject I had ever encountered. I can pinpoint the exact moment my heart betrayed the simple, safe confines of our friendship. It was the autumn of our senior year. A group of us had driven out to a lake for a bonfire. The air was cold and smelled of wood smoke and damp earth. Someone was playing a guitar, a soft, melancholic melody that seemed to melt into the darkness. Finn was sitting across the fire from me, telling a story. He was animated, his hands shaping the narrative in the air, his face illuminated by the dancing flames. He laughed at his own punchline, a deep, uninhibited sound that echoed across the water, and as he threw his head back, the firelight caught in his eyes, turning them to molten gold. And in that instant, a trapdoor opened in the floor of my chest, and my heart simply fell through. It was a terrifying, silent, and irreversible plummet. The realization washed over me not with a violent crash, but with a slow, sinking certainty. I loved him, not in the way a friend loves a friend. It was something more, something deeper, more dangerous, and utterly hopeless. I did what I did best. I hid. I took that beautiful, terrible feeling and I buried it in the deepest part of myself. I built a fortress around it, reinforcing the walls with every casual, friendly touch, every platonic, love you, man, he threw my way as he ended a phone call. My camera became both my shield and my confessional. I had hundreds of photographs of him, candid shots he was mostly unaware of. Finn laughing, Finn staring thoughtfully into the distance, Finn asleep on my couch, long before it became a ritual, looking younger and more vulnerable than the world ever saw him. I told myself I was documenting our friendship, creating a record of our time together. But I knew, in the quiet solitude of my darkroom, as his image slowly materialized in the chemical bath, that I was trying to possess something I could never truly have. I was capturing his light so I could keep a piece of it for myself in the darkness. After graduation, our lives diverged in practice, but not in spirit. I found a small studio apartment and started a career as a freelance photographer, a life of quiet observation and uncertain paychecks. Finn was recruited by a major tech consulting firm, a job that sent him flying across the country from one sterile hotel and conference room to another. Despite the distance, we remained each other's constant. He was the first person I called when I sold my first major print. I was the one he called from a lonely hotel bar in a city he couldn't remember the name of, just to hear a familiar voice. And then there were the women. There was always a woman. Jessica, then Chloe, then for a long, serious stretch, there was Sarah. They were all lovely, intelligent, and completely wrong for him, but I played my part. I was the supportive best friend. I listened to him talk about them for hours. I offered advice when he asked for it, and I smiled and said all the right things when he brought them to meet me. Each time felt like swallowing shards of glass, a slow, internal bleeding that no one could see. I learned to live with the dull ache of it, a permanent phantom limb of a love I would never get to experience. I convinced myself that this was enough. Having him in my life, in any capacity, was better than not having him at all. The friendship was the masterpiece. My love for him was the ugly, hidden frame that held it all together. I would never risk the art for the sake of the frame. The shift began subtly, not with a bang, but with a slow, quiet unraveling. It started the day Finn called me to tell me that he and Sarah were over. It had been nearly 2 years, the longest he'd ever been with anyone. I had braced myself for this call for months. I'd seen the cracks forming, the way he spoke of their future with a hollow, practiced enthusiasm that didn't reach his eyes. I prepared my script of sympathetic words, my role as the supportive friend ready for another performance. But when he spoke, his voice was devoid of the dramatic grief I'd expected. It was just empty, utterly and terrifyingly empty. He said it had been mutual, a quiet, sensible decision. There was no shouting, no final, dramatic fight. Just a conversation over a sterile white tablecloth in a restaurant that was too expensive, where they both admitted they were trying to force a puzzle piece into a space it would never fit. The weirdest part, Leo, he'd said, his voice a ghost on the other end of the line, is that I don't feel sad. I feel nothing. It's like I was playing a role for so long, and now the play is over, and I'm just standing on an empty stage. I don't even know what my next line is. He told me that Sarah had said he was like a beautiful house with all the lights on, but nobody home. He'd laughed as he said it, but the sound was brittle, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. That was the moment the ground began to change beneath our feet. His emptiness was more alarming than any heartbreak I had ever witnessed in him. Heartbreak was an active wound. It bled, it hurt, and eventually, it scarred over and healed. This was a void, a vacuum, and it is the nature of a vacuum to pull everything around it into its center. He was supposed to be on a project in Chicago that week, but he flew home early. He showed up at my door, unannounced, his travel bag still in his hand. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him. His usually confident posture slumped, the vibrant blue of his eyes clouded over with a deep, weary fog. He didn't say much. He just walked in, dropped his bag by the door, and sank onto my couch as if his bones had suddenly turned to lead. I didn't press him. I just made him a cup of tea, the way I always did, and put on an old movie we both loved, a comforting blanket of familiar dialogue and music. He didn't watch it. He just stared at the screen, his gaze a million miles away. That night marked the beginning of his extended stay in the orbit of my life. His own apartment, a sleek, minimalist space across town, seemed to repel him. He said it felt like a hotel room he could never check out of. My place, by contrast, was cluttered and lived in. It was filled with books stacked in precarious towers, with the faint, ever-present scent of darkroom chemicals, with the tangible evidence of a life being actively, if quietly, lived. It was an anchor, and he was a ship lost in a fog. In the weeks that followed, the confident, charismatic Finn I knew was replaced by a quieter, more spectral version of himself. The constant motion ceased. He had been a runner, someone who processed his thoughts and anxieties by pounding miles out on the pavement. But he stopped running. He just stopped. Instead, he would sit, sometimes for hours, watching me work in my studio, the click of my camera shutter the only sound in the room. He needed presence more than he needed conversation. He was like a plant that had been deprived of sunlight. slowly turning himself toward the smallest sliver of warmth. And I, for better or worse, was that warmth. My carefully constructed fortress, the one designed to keep my feelings in and his casual, platonic affection at a safe distance, was suddenly repurposed. It was no longer a prison for my own heart, but a sanctuary for his. And I didn't know how to guard a place that was meant to be a refuge. The rules I had lived by for 6 years were beginning to dissolve, and I was terrified of what might emerge in their place. The ritual began with the door. It was such a small thing, a detail so insignificant that at first, I was sure I was imagining it, projecting my own desperate hope onto the mundane architecture of my apartment. When Finn started staying over, sleeping in my small guest room, he would always close the door firmly behind him. It was a clear, unspoken boundary. This is my space, that is yours. Our friendship exists in the hallway between them. I understood it. I respected it. It was a boundary that kept me safe. But then, about a month after his breakup with Sarah, I noticed a change. I was lying in my own bed, reading, when I saw it. The door to his room was no longer fully closed. It was left ajar, just a crack, allowing a thin blade of light from the hallway to slice across his threshold. I stared at that sliver of light for a long time, my book forgotten in my lap. My heart began a slow, heavy drum against my ribs. It was nothing. It was a coincidence. He was tired and had simply forgotten to pull it shut. I repeated these rationalizations to myself like a mantra, a charm against the dangerous tendrils of hope that were beginning to unfurl in my chest. But the next night, it happened again. And the night after that, the open door became a silent, nightly question mark hanging in the space between our rooms. I would lie in the darkness of my own room, acutely aware of his presence just down the hall. I could hear the faint rustle of his sheets as he turned over, the soft sigh of his breathing as he fell asleep. That small, deliberate gap in the doorway felt like a confession, like a bridge being tentatively extended across a chasm of unspoken feelings. Or, and this was the fear that kept me awake, it meant nothing at all. It was just a door, and I was a man dying of thirst, seeing an oasis in a simple household object. I was turning my home into a text to be analyzed, every creak of the floorboards a word, every shadow a sentence. I was losing my mind. The next phase of the ritual moved from the hallway to the living room. Our evenings had settled into a comfortable pattern. We'd make dinner, or order in, and then migrate to the couch to watch a movie. My couch was old and soft, a deep, worn corduroy that had molded itself to the shape of comfort over the years. We would start on opposite ends, a respectable cushion's distance between us, a buffer zone that was part of the unspoken treaty of our friendship. But as the nights wore on, Finn, weighed down by an exhaustion that seemed more spiritual than physical, would begin to drift. The first time it happened, he simply slumped sideways, his head coming to rest on my shoulder with a soft thud. I froze. Every muscle in my body went rigid. I held my breath, waiting for him to stir, to realize what he'd done and pull away with a reflexive, embarrassed apology. But he didn't. He just sighed, a deep, shuddering exhalation, and settled more firmly against me, already lost to sleep. I sat there for 2 hours, my arm going numb, a cramp forming in my neck, not daring to move a single inch. I studied the side of his face in the flickering light of the television. The dark sweep of his eyelashes against his cheek, the slight parting of his lips, the absolute, unguarded trust in his posture. It was an act of profound vulnerability, and it undid me completely. My carefully constructed walls crumbled to dust in an instant. All I could feel was a wave of overwhelming, protective tenderness. This man, who strode through the world with such confidence, was seeking refuge against my shoulder. In the morning, he woke with a start, blinking in the early morning light. He pulled back immediately, a flush creeping up his neck. "Oh God, Leo. I'm so sorry. I totally passed out." He was flustered, apologetic. I just shrugged, forcing a casualness I did not feel. "Don't worry about it. You were obviously exhausted. I had to make it okay for him. I had to maintain the fiction that this was meaningless, a simple consequence of fatigue, because the alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. But it kept happening. It became the new normal. The initial pretense of accidental sleepiness slowly eroded, replaced by a quiet, deliberate act of seeking comfort. He would no longer slump, but shift, purposefully, until he was leaning against me. He would rest his head on my shoulder as the opening credits of a film began to roll, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And I would let him. Each time, my body would betray me with a jolt of adrenaline, a silent scream of "this is it," before settling into a state of heightened, agonizing awareness. I learned the precise weight of his head. I learned the pattern of his breathing as it deepened into sleep. I learned the way his hair felt against my cheek, soft and smelling faintly of that green, herbal shampoo. I was a cartographer mapping a new and dangerous territory. Every point of contact was a landmark, every shared silence a vast, uncharted ocean. The ritual escalated on a cold, rainy night in November. A storm was raging outside, the wind rattling the old window frames of my apartment, the rain lashing against the glass in furious waves. We were on the couch, of course. A thick blanket was spread over both of us. This time, he didn't just lean his head on my shoulder. He shifted his entire body, turning towards me and tucking his head into the space between my neck and my shoulder, his arm coming to rest across my waist. He curled into me, fitting his body against mine as if he were a key designed for a lock he had only just discovered. My heart didn't just beat, it detonated. It was a silent, violent explosion in my chest that I was sure he must have felt. He was so close. I could feel the warmth of his breath on my skin, the slow, steady thump of his heart against my side. He was pretending to be asleep. I was sure of it. His breathing was too even, his posture too intentional. He was hiding in plain sight, using the guise of sleep to ask for something he couldn't bring himself to request with words. And I was his willing accomplice in this charade of unconsciousness. I let him hide. I provided the sanctuary. I sat there, rigid and trembling, my hand hovering for an eternity over his back before I finally let it rest there, a gesture of comfort that felt like a seismic, life-altering confession. We stayed like that until the storm passed and the sun began to rise. Two people clinging to each other in a sea of unspoken words, both of us pretending we didn't know we were awake. The final boundary fell a week later. The pretense of the couch had been stretched to its absolute limit. We both knew it. The air in my apartment had become thick with things unsaid, charged with a tension that was both exquisite and unbearable. One night, after another long, silent evening, he stood up to go to the guest room. He hesitated at the door, his hand on the knob. He turned back to look at me, and in his eyes, I saw a profound and desperate loneliness that mirrored my own. "The guest room feels," he started, then trailed off, unable to find the right word. Cold, I knew what was coming. It felt like standing on a cliff edge, the wind at my back. I could step back, or I could let myself fall. You can stay in here if you want," I heard myself say, the words feeling foreign and clumsy in my mouth. I tried to make it casual. "It's a big bed. I'll stay on my side." He gave me a small, grateful smile that didn't quite reach his haunted eyes. "Okay," he whispered. That first night was torture. We might as well have been on opposite sides of the Grand Canyon. We lay on the very edges of the mattress, our backs to each other, a vast, cold expanse of sheet between us. I was so hyper-aware of his presence, of the sound of his breathing in the quiet room, that I didn't sleep at all. I just lay there, my body a single, taut nerve, staring into the darkness. It went on like this for 3 nights. We shared a bed, but we were more distant than we had been on the couch. We had crossed a physical line, but in doing so, we had erected an even larger emotional barrier. The ambiguity of the couch had been a comfort. The stark reality of the bed was a confrontation. On the 4th night, something broke. I was lying on my side, facing the wall, when I felt the mattress shift. I felt him move, a slow, deliberate motion across the empty space between us. And then, I felt the warmth of his body press against my back. He curled himself around me, his front flush against my back, one arm sliding around my waist, his hand coming to rest on my stomach. His head found the crook of my neck, and he let out a long, shuddering sigh, a sound of such profound relief and surrender that it broke my heart. He was giving up. He was tired of the distance, tired of the pretense. He was simply coming home. I lay there, unable to breathe, my entire world shrinking to the points of contact between our bodies. The solid weight of his chest against my shoulder blades, the gentle pressure of his arm around me, the soft puff of his breath on my neck. I slowly, tentatively, covered his hand with my own. His fingers reflexively tightened around mine. And we slept. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, we both truly slept, anchored to each other in the quiet darkness, two lost ships who had finally found their harbor. The ritual was complete. A new language had been fully formed, and its vocabulary was touch, its grammar was trust, and its meaning was a terrifying and beautiful thing I still did not dare to name. The crossing happened on a Sunday. It was a gray, quiet afternoon, the kind that feels suspended in time. The rain had started again, a soft, persistent drumming against the windows that muted the sounds of the city and enclosed us in our own small world. We were on the couch, of course. The couch had become our stage, the primary setting for the silent play we had been enacting for months. The television was on, but neither of us was watching. A movie was playing, some black-and-white classic with dialogue that felt a world away, but it was just background noise, a screen to stare at so we didn't have to look at each other. Finn was tucked against my side in our now familiar configuration, his head resting on my shoulder, his arms slung loosely over my chest. But this time was different. He wasn't asleep. I knew he wasn't. His breathing was too shallow, and I could feel a fine, nervous tremor running through his body, a current of energy that communicated itself directly to me. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with the accumulated weight of every unspoken word, every hesitant touch, every shared glance from the past few months. I was intensely aware of everything. The soft scratch of his sweater against my cheek, the faint, clean scent of his skin, the almost imperceptible rise and fall of his chest with each breath. My own heart was a frantic, trapped bird, beating its wings against the cage of my ribs. I was sure he could feel it, sure the thunder of it was echoing through my whole body and into his. The movie on the screen reached its dramatic conclusion. The hero kissed the heroine. The music swelled. The words, "the end," appeared. The screen went black, and the silence that descended upon the room was absolute. It was a physical presence, a heavy blanket that smothered all sound, leaving only the frantic drumming of my own pulse in my ears. This was it. I felt a sense of inevitability, the way you can feel the air change right before a lightning strike. The moment had arrived, and there was nowhere left to hide. Slowly, as if moving through water, Finn lifted his head from my shoulder. He didn't move away. He just shifted back enough to look at me. His face was only inches from mine. In the dim, gray light filtering through the window, I could see every detail. The faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the slight tremble of his lower lip. His eyes, usually so bright and clear, were dark and deep, like looking into a well. They were filled with a raw, terrifying vulnerability, an emotion I had never seen in him before. It was a look of profound fear, but also of desperate, pleading hope. He was on the edge of the same cliff I was, and he was asking me to jump with him. His voice, when it came, was a whisper, so quiet I almost thought I'd imagined it. "Leo." My own voice was trapped somewhere in my throat. I managed a sound, a strangled noise that was meant to be his name. I cleared my throat and tried again. "Yeah." He didn't break eye contact. His gaze held mine, a silent communication passing between us that was more articulate than any words could ever be. He was asking for permission. He was giving me an out. He was laying his own terrified, confused heart bare and trusting me not to crush it. "Would it be okay?" he whispered, his voice cracking on the last word. The question hung in the air between us, shimmering with a terrifying, beautiful power. He didn't need to specify what he was asking. We both knew. The air crackled with the understanding. "Would it be okay if I dismantled the friendship that has been your life's foundation?" Would it be okay if I crossed the one line we have never, ever crossed? Would it be okay if I risked everything, right here, right now, for a chance at something I don't even understand? My throat was tight, my lungs burning for air. Words were impossible. I could feel the entire history of our friendship, the 6 years of buried feelings, the months of agonizing, beautiful tension, all converging on this single, pivotal point in time. My entire world had narrowed to the space between his lips and mine. I gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, a tiny movement of my head that felt like the most significant physical act of my entire life. It was all the answer he needed. He leaned in, closing the final few inches between us with an excruciating slowness. He was still giving me a chance to retreat, to turn my head, to say no. I didn't. I held my ground. I met him halfway. The first touch of his lips to mine was impossibly soft. It wasn't a kiss of passion or demand. It was a question, a confession, a sigh of relief. It was tentative, hesitant, and trembling with the fear of 1,000 unspoken things. It was the taste of rain and salt and a loneliness so profound it had finally found its echo in another. It lasted only a moment, but it felt like a lifetime. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. We stayed like that, just breathing, the silence no longer heavy with tension, but filled with a fragile, shimmering peace. The storm outside had quieted. The world had shifted on its axis. And in the quiet aftermath, for the first time, I felt a tremor of something I had long since given up on: hope. The hope was a fragile, newborn thing, and it did not survive the night. I awoke the next morning to an empty space beside me in the bed. For a moment, tangled in the drowsy fog of sleep, I felt a simple, uncomplicated contentment. But as consciousness returned, a cold dread began to seep into my veins. The apartment was too quiet. The usual sounds of Finn moving around in the kitchen, the clink of a coffee mug, the soft thud of the refrigerator door closing, were absent. There was only silence. I sat up, my heart beginning a frantic, panicked rhythm against my ribs. On his pillow, propped against the rumpled sheets where his head had been, was a folded piece of paper. My hands trembled as I picked it up. The note was short, his familiar scrawl uncharacteristically tense. Had to run. Early meeting I forgot about. See you later, that was it. No mention of the kiss. No acknowledgement of the seismic shift that had occurred between us just hours before. It was a note of brutal, devastating normalcy. It was a denial, an erasure. He had built a bridge across the chasm, and then, in the dead of night, he had set it on fire and retreated to his side, leaving me stranded. I sat on the edge of the bed, the note clutched in my hand, and felt the beautiful, shimmering peace of the previous evening shatter into a million tiny, sharp pieces. The silence in the apartment was no longer peaceful. It was accusatory. It was the sound of absence, the sound of regret. The hours turned into days. See you later turned out to be a lie. He didn't call. He didn't text. My messages to him, first casual, then concerned, then pleading, went unanswered, sitting in the cold, digital space of my phone with the single, damning word, delivered. He had become a ghost. He had vanished from my life as suddenly as he had first appeared in it all those years ago. The pain was a physical thing. It was a hollow, aching cavity in my chest where my heart used to be. I replayed the kiss, the question, our shared silence, over and over again in my mind, searching for the moment I had gotten it wrong. Had I misread everything? Was his vulnerability just a moment of profound confusion, a symptom of his loneliness that he had mistaken for something more? Had he woken up in the clear, cold light of day and been horrified by what he had done, by who he had done it with? The shame was a hot, bitter flood. I felt like a fool. I had let myself hope. I had opened the gates to my fortress, and for what? To be plundered and then abandoned. The quiet intimacy of my apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a tomb, haunted by the ghost of his presence. Every corner held a memory: the couch where he had slept on my chest, the kitchen where we'd cooked together, the bed that now felt impossibly, cruelly large. After a week of this agonizing silence, something inside me broke. It was a quiet snap. The grief and shame curdled into a hard, cold knot of anger. Anger at him for his cowardice, but also anger at myself for allowing my life to be so completely defined by his orbit. I couldn't live in this limbo, this purgatory of unanswered questions. I needed to know. Even if the truth was the worst thing I could imagine, it had to be better than this suffocating uncertainty. I put on my jacket, my movements stiff and robotic, and walked out of my apartment. I didn't have a plan. I just knew I had to go to him. I had to stand in front of him and force him to look at me, to acknowledge what had happened between us. I had to demand an ending, even if it was a brutal one. His apartment building was one of those new, sterile glass towers that all looked the same. I had only been there a handful of times. He always preferred the lived-in chaos of my place. As I stood in the silent, antiseptic hallway in front of his door, my anger began to falter, replaced by a wave of nauseating fear. What was I even doing here? What if he didn't answer? What if he did, and he looked at me with pity or disgust? I almost turned around. I almost fled back to the relative safety of my own misery. But then I thought of that kiss, of the desperate, pleading hope in his eyes. That had been real. I hadn't imagined it. Whatever his fear was, I deserved to know what I was up against. I took a deep breath and knocked on the door. The silence stretched for a long moment. I could hear faint sounds from within. I knocked again, louder this time. Finally, I heard the sound of the deadbolt sliding back. The door opened a few inches, and he was there. He looked terrible. He was wearing clothes that were rumpled as if he'd slept in them. His hair was a mess, and there were dark, bruised-looking circles under his eyes. He hadn't been at an early meeting. He'd been hiding. He looked surprised to see me, then a wave of something else, panic, guilt, fear, washed over his face. He tried to close the door slightly, a reflexive gesture of self-protection. "Leo, hey, now's not a good time." His voice was rough. "No," I said, my own voice firmer than I expected it to be. I put my hand on the door, stopping him from closing it. "We're not doing this, Finn. You don't get to do that. You don't get to kiss me and then disappear. You owe me an explanation." He flinched at the word kiss, as if I had struck him. He looked past me down the empty hallway. Then finally, reluctantly, he opened the door wider and stepped back, letting me in. His apartment was as I remembered it, cold, impersonal, and immaculate, except for the takeout containers and coffee cups littering the surfaces. It was the landscape of a siege. He had barricaded himself in. He wouldn't look at me. He just walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and stared out at the city below, his back to me. "Just say it, Finn," I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. "Whatever it is, just be honest with me for once. Was it a mistake? Were you just lonely and confused? Did you regret it as soon as it happened? Just tell me, so I can move on." He was silent for a long time, his shoulders hunched. I could see his reflection in the dark glass of the window, his expression a mask of torment. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with unshed tears. "A mistake," he said, his voice cracking. "God, Leo, that's the whole problem. It wasn't a mistake." He finally turned to face me, and his eyes were full of a desperate, cornered anguish. "It was the only thing that's felt real in years. And that terrifies me more than anything I have ever felt in my entire life. I don't understand," I whispered, though I was beginning to. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized as his tell for extreme stress. "You have to understand," he began, pacing the small space like a caged animal. "My whole life has been a script. I do what I'm supposed to do. I get the right grades. I join the right teams. I get the right job. I date the right girls. It's all a performance. And it's exhausting. After Sarah, it was like the curtain came down, and I was just standing there, and I had no idea who I was when I wasn't playing a part. The only place I felt real was with you, in your apartment. With you." He stopped pacing and looked at me, his gaze raw and pleading. That comfort, it started out as friendship, I swear it did. But it had changed. It deepened into something else, and I was too scared to even look at it. I didn't know what it meant. I just knew I needed it. "I needed you." He took a shaky breath. "That night, on the couch, when I kissed you, it was like I was coming up for air after being underwater for years. It was a reflex, an instinct. It felt right. More right than anything with Sarah or Chloe or anyone. And the second it was over, I panicked. Because what does that mean, Leo? What does it mean about me? About us? All I could think was that I had just destroyed the single most important thing in my entire life. Our friendship. I thought you'd hate me. I thought I had taken your kindness and your safety and twisted it into something you never wanted. He finally broke, his voice collapsing into a sob. So I ran. I ran because I was a coward. I was afraid of what it meant. And I was terrified of losing you. I stood there, frozen, as his confession washed over me. All my anger, all my hurt, just evaporated, replaced by a profound, aching sadness. Not for me, but for him. For all the years he had spent living a life that wasn't his, for the fear that had been suffocating him. He wasn't running from me. He was running from himself. The fortress I had built to protect my own heart was nothing compared to the prison he had built for his. I crossed the room in 2 steps and stood in front of him. He wouldn't meet my eyes, his gaze fixed on the floor, his shoulders shaking. I reached out and gently tilted his chin up, forcing him to look at me. You think you could destroy our friendship? I said, my voice soft but firm. Finn, you are my friendship. You're it. There's nothing without you. He stared at me, his blue eyes swimming with tears and confusion. And I knew, in that moment, that it was my turn to be brave. It was my turn to tear down the last wall. I have been in love with you for 6 years, I said, the words finally spoken aloud. Since that bonfire at the lake in senior year. Everything you've been feeling, the comfort, the rightness of it all. I've been feeling it too. For years. You didn't destroy anything. You just finally opened a door I was too scared to even knock on. His face crumpled, a mixture of disbelief, relief, and a grief so profound it stole my breath. He let out a choked sound and collapsed against me, burying his face in my shoulder, his arms wrapping around me tightly, holding on as if he were drowning. I held him back, just as tightly, my hand stroking his hair, my own tears finally falling, hot and silent. We stood there in the middle of his cold, empty apartment, 2 broken people clinging to each other, and for the first time, there were no more secrets, no more pretenses, no more fear. There was only the shattering, terrifying, and beautiful truth. And in the ruins of all the walls we had built, we finally began to find each other. The conversation that followed lasted for hours. We sat on his uncomfortable, stylish sofa, a space that had never known the easy comfort of my own, and we talked. We unraveled the tangled knot of our shared history, laying every fear, every misunderstanding, every buried feeling out in the open. It was a painful, cleansing process, like setting a bone that has healed incorrectly. He told me about the immense pressure he'd always felt to conform to a specific image of masculinity, an image that left no room for the kind of tenderness and emotional intimacy he'd only ever found with me. He spoke of his relationships as a series of roles he was trying to play, convinced that if he just performed well enough, he would eventually feel the things he was supposed to feel. But the feeling was never there. It was always a hollow echo. With me, he said, there was no performance. There was just a quiet, terrifying, and liberating truth. I, in turn, told him everything. I confessed the years of silent pining, the jealousy I'd swallowed every time he'd introduced me to a new girlfriend, the hundreds of photographs I had of him that were less a documentation of our friendship and more a secret, desperate act of worship. I told him how his casual, unknowing intimacy had been both a source of exquisite hope and agonizing torture. I explained that when he ran, it hadn't just hurt me. It had confirmed my deepest, most guarded fear, that I was unlovable, that my feelings were a burden, a thing to be hidden away lest they ruin the good things in my life. As I spoke the words, I could feel their power over me diminishing. The secrets I had guarded for so long, the ones that had felt like heavy, toxic stones in my gut, became lighter, simpler, once they were exposed to the air and held in the gentle, accepting space of his understanding. There were tears, of course. There was a profound sadness for the years we had lost to fear and miscommunication. But underneath it all, a new foundation was being laid. It was built not on assumptions or pretense, but on the solid bedrock of honesty. We agreed to start over. Not from the beginning, because our shared history was too precious to discard, but from a new beginning, a place of intention. We would take it slow, we decided. We would learn this new language together, word by word, not in the feigned unconsciousness of sleep, but in the clear, steady light of day. When I finally left his apartment late that night, the sky was beginning to pale with the promise of dawn. As he walked me to the door, he hesitated, then reached out and took my hand, his fingers lacing through mine. It wasn't a desperate, clinging hold like before. It was a simple, solid connection. A promise. "Don't be a stranger," he said, a small, tired smile on his face. "I won't," I promised back. And we both knew it was true. The weeks that followed were a study in quiet reclamation. We were rebuilding our world, and we did it with a gentle, deliberate care. We spent time together, but it was different now. The agonizing subtext was gone, replaced by a simple, spoken truth. If he wanted to hold my hand while we walked down the street, he would just reach for it. If I wanted to kiss him goodnight, I would. Each small act of affection was a revelation, a quiet celebration of our newfound freedom. He started staying at my apartment again, but there was no more ambiguity, no more guest room charade. He brought over a toothbrush, then a few changes of clothes, then a box of his favorite books. Slowly, piece by piece, he began to move his life into mine, not as a refugee seeking temporary shelter, but as a man consciously, deliberately, choosing to build a home. The final piece of the old world fell away one Saturday night. We were in my bed, lying side by side, reading in a comfortable, easy silence. The air between us was no longer charged with the frantic energy of unspoken tension, but filled with a deep, calm peace. It was a quiet, so profound it felt like a presence in the room. I looked over at him, at the way the soft light from the bedside lamp caught the curve of his cheek and the dark sweep of his lashes. He must have felt my gaze, because he looked up from his book and met my eyes. He smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that reached all the way to his eyes, crinkling the corners in that way I had cataloged 1,000 times. He didn't say anything. He just reached over and put his book on the nightstand, then took mine from my hands and did the same. He shifted closer, wrapped his arms around me, and pulled me against his chest. I rested my head in the familiar space of his shoulder, breathing in his scent, and closed my eyes. And as I drifted off to sleep, I felt him press a soft, lingering kiss to the top of my head. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a confession. It was a statement. It said, "You are home. I am home. We are home." And for the first time, I noticed the bedroom door was fully, securely closed. We learn, eventually, that a home is not a structure of wood and nails, but a construct of safety and acceptance. It is not about the four walls that surround you, but about the arms that hold you. The most important rooms we will ever inhabit are not the ones with doors and windows, but the quiet, internal chambers of our own hearts. For years, I had kept mine locked and shuttered, a museum of one-sided love that no one was ever allowed to visit. And he had lived in a house with all the lights on, but with every room feeling empty. We were two lonely people, rattling around in our own solitary spaces, afraid of the silence, and even more afraid of letting someone else in to fill it. But we found each other. Or rather, we stopped being afraid to see that we had been there all along. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we'd learned to create together, a silence that was no longer about the things left unsaid, but about the things that no longer needed to be said at all. It was the quiet peace of finding your harbor, of dropping your anchor, of knowing, with a certainty that settles deep in your bones, that you will never have to sail alone again.